Power knows no pity. In order to create a new powerful type of man, not only should one not help one's neighbors, but one should even try to hasten their demise. Nietzsche, a collection of critical essays. This video is just my reasoning within a certain concept that may seem perplexing to many. And that's okay. There are areas deep inside your head that are not illusorily interfering with your daily existence. These areas reduce the likelihood of grand success in your life to almost zero. Do you know what the paradox is? People will tell you that the functioning of these brain structures is a virtue. On April 19, 1841, the ship William Brown collided with an iceberg and began to sink rapidly. There were 81 people on board, including crew members. 2 lifeboats were provided for emergencies. On them, all this crowd was somehow accommodated, thus exceeding the maximum allowable carrying capacity. The wind was crazy, and the rain was pouring down like a bucket. The captain, Alexander Holmes, was faced with a choice. He could leave everything as it was, and everyone would be guaranteed death. Or he could get rid of the extra weight by forcibly pushing some of the passengers out, thereby deliberately dooming them to death. This is a typical moral dilemma, in which the choice of any course of action violates the prescribed moral guidelines. In this situation, Alexander Holmes made a tough decision and, together with other crew members, began to throw people into the icy waters of the Atlantic. Thanks to that, most of the passengers were saved. What would you do if you were in his position? Emotions dictate how, what, and when you do things. Many of them are so strong that it is impossible to brush them off with a mere effort of will. At the same time, there is a whole range of destructive emotions which no longer meet modern requirements. Such emotions often contradict your rational nature and make your body react inadequately to the situation. There are moments when, from the point of view of higher cognitive functions, you know exactly what is necessary, you understand how to achieve it, but you cannot realize what you have planned because your emotions create an insurmountable barrier for you. And that's why you're so eager to tweak them, dampen them, or turn them off altogether. You are a doctor, and you have 5 patients who urgently need transplants of 5 different organs. Otherwise, they will die. Then a completely healthy person comes to see you to be inoculated with an experimental drug for a fee. After checking in, you learn that he has a signed donor card and his organs are completely suitable for transplantation to your patients. You have 2 choices: inject him with the experimental drug, do the research, give him the money, and let him go home. Or inject him with poison, transplant his organs to your patients, and explain his death as a rare allergic reaction to the components of the experimental drug. You're a professional and you'll do it without anyone knowing about it. 5 live people for the price of 1. What's it gonna be? The absolute king of all emotions is fear. Fear is the most powerful motivator of behavior that exists. In the emotional hierarchy, fear is so privileged that it can turn the crown of evolution into an irrational animal in the blink of an eye. Humans have evolved the fear response as a survival mechanism to protect themselves from predators. But millions of years later, in a world where wild animals don't roam the streets, the fear system can be oversensitized and react to dangers that don't really exist, constantly forcing us to make illogical and irrational decisions. What's literally deadly about public speaking, or in meeting someone you like on the street, or an exam? How could it possibly jeopardize your life? It doesn't. However, our anciently designed bodies react to such things in the same way as they would to a wolf in the woods. Heart and respiration rates increase, blood rushes to internal organs to prevent blood loss from possible surface tissue damage. Muscle strength increases, digestion stops, pupils dilate, instant reflexes accelerate, and so on and so forth. Similarly, the emotions of guilt and shame are virtually beyond our control, experiencing the feeling in their radical form and unable to rid yourself of them. Many people have ended their lives by suicide. Guilt and shame are believed to be internal programs that suppress the individual to please society. What is the survival factor of the species? Those who were willing to work as a team survived and passed their genes on. The outcasts in the wild died. For thousands of years, man has developed emotional algorithms that make him meet the expectations of his fellow tribesmen, contributing to social cohesion. But today in civilized countries, thanks to developed infrastructure and economy, almost every person can live autonomously and independently, self-serving any of his needs. And the guilt and shame of blaming shame. Now, for the most part, these emotions rather put you in a position of dependence on the opinion of others, preventing you from living your own life, and for yourself, simply limiting your individuality and impulses for self-expression. It's easy to feel this. Try refusing a friend's help without making any excuses. Just say "I don't want to" when you really don't want to, and see what your guilt does to you. Or instead of dressing up without making it hard on yourself, go shopping in your pajamas and see what your feelings of shame do to you. It's not hard to see, following the logic, that both guilt and shame have their roots in that same good old feeling of fear. You won't say no to a friend because you're afraid he'll say no to you next time. You won't go out in your pajamas because you're afraid of being ridiculous and feeling people's sideways glances on you, because you've got this attitude in your subconscious. If you don't fit in, you'll be an outcast. If you're an outcast, you'll die. But I'll show you something even more graphic. What do you feel? What is that? Is that a faint note of pity for the iron? If the robot made tearful noises, screaming in pain and begging you not to do it, your mind tells you the strictly logical thing. It's a robot. It's not alive, and it doesn't feel anything. But your emotions trumpet the opposite. This is my favorite example of dissonance. That human feeling when two opposing entities start living in you at the same moment in time. Empathy, compassion, and sympathy are not bad feelings that allow us to better penetrate and subtly understand the emotional state of others. But like other emotions, they are not turned off by willpower, even when it is really necessary, and even when they go against common sense and logic. And there is nothing that can be done about it. We are too often compassionate where a firm hand is needed, giving a chance to people who have repeatedly betrayed our trust. We don't fire a lousy employee out of pity. The sight of mutilation and blood keeps us from thinking in a collected way when administering first aid to an injured person. While exploring the caves, you and your group find yourselves at a dead end. You need to go back, but in the only passage through which you can escape, the most obese member of the expedition is stuck. The water level in the cave is gradually rising, and pretty soon you will all drown. We have to act. You have tried everything, in fact, everything possible, but you can't push out the stuck person. You have a stick of dynamite, however, and you can blow up the wall with the stuck guy to save yourself and the others. From a math standpoint, the choice is obvious, but what will you do? Why does this happen? Why aren't emotional responses being transformed to suit the needs of modern man, even though there is an urgent need to do so? The fact is that a colossal role in the construction of emotions is played by the limbic system. This is the most ancient hormonal instinctive structure of the brain, which was formed over millions of years. At the snap of a finger, they don't change. The emotions listed above and some other emotions, and their nuances, never appear in isolation. They are too connected to each other and make up our moral compass. Right now, there are two versions of you. The you want to be and the real you. The distance between the former and the latter will be determined enormously by your moral compass. Fear, guilt, shame, empathy, love. These are the indicators on which a person's notions of good and bad, right and wrong, good and evil are anchored. The sum total of these and a few other sensory triggers represents human morality in action. But where in the modern world will your moral compass take you if a huge part of your value and belief system is powered by the old brain infrastructure? In case you haven't realized it, it's something as shaky and biased as morality that is very often the stumbling block to all that rationality and progress represent. It is human morality that most often blocks the way to the metaphorical Olympus for humanity in general, and for you in particular. From this perspective, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche rebels against modern morality. Morality condemns in man precisely that striving in him which serves as a guarantee of his success, his egoism, his self-love. At the same time, morality praises all that is detrimental to human development. We extol those actions and qualities which, while being harmful to the individual, create a type of man useful to society. We are ready to justify every sacrifice of the individual for the benefit of society. We wish to cultivate in the individual the mood of a sacrificial animal. At the same time, we look with horror at any person who wants to live for himself and in benevolent aspirations sees the absorption of the individual into society. Nietzsche, a collection of critical essays. But paradoxically, Nietzsche argues that it is self-loving aspirations that are the strongest drivers not only for one person, but for humanity as a whole. Years after Nietzsche's death, 2 world wars broke out on Earth, which gave an unprecedented impetus to the development of medicine, led to the creation of the first programmable computers, and allowed humanity for the first time in history to go into outer space and even land on the moon. Yes, we owe much of today's scientific and technological advances to the chilling wars. Nietzsche wrote that the rise of the human race requires evil and danger, which harden the will, and strong passions, without which man is unable to create anything great. Power, envy, self-interest, violence, malice, all these qualities are as necessary for progressive movement as the opposite qualities. The strongest and most ruthless men have always been the prime movers of humanity. They ignited in society dormant passions, awakened in it the spirit of comparison and contradiction, the struggle of opinions and ideals, the search for the new and untried. They did this by raising arms, overturning boundary stones, and insulting cherished shrines. History's proven utility of evil serves as the best refutation of modern utilitarian morality. Morality wrongly identifies the good with the expedient and useful, and the evil with the impractical and harmful. Nietzsche, on the other hand, believed that the annihilation of evil would be tantamount to the cessation of all progressive movement, and therefore the greatness of humanity can only lie outside the limits of human morality. If experiments on human beings were permitted, how far would mankind advance in the treatment of disease? Would it be possible to sacrifice 1,000 to save millions? But these are 2 impersonal questions. Back to you. Would you personally be able to throw passengers into the icy waters of the Atlantic in cold blood so that most of them would be saved? Would you kill 1 innocent patient to use his organs to save the lives of 5? Would you blow up a cave wall with a living person who can't be helped so that other people could survive? We don't even want to put all these situations through our heads, let alone give any concrete answer. The dilemmas described perfectly illustrate how there is always an invisible but very well-felt censor standing over your pragmatism and logic. In Nietzsche's words, it is characteristic of man to mistake for virtue what in fact turns out to be vice in disguise. It is much easier for people to convince themselves that they are reasonable and civilized rather than spineless and weak. In science fiction stories, the man of the future is often portrayed as a highly rational and unemotional being. Yes, that's right. Reason is contrasted with a range of destructive emotions. But what if these very people of the future are already among us? They understand emotions, but they don't have the excessive palette of feelings of the average person. These people are not anxious, do not feel pity for their neighbors, and do not know how to love someone with all their heart. This category of human beings, at the physical level, do not experience such things. The brain structures responsible for such emotions do not work in the same way as in ordinary humans. There are about 75 million of these individuals on Earth. They may be in the next stage of evolution. These people are psychopaths. And yes, you have the mass media to thank for your likely reaction to the word psychopath. Psychopathy, and sociopathy are sometimes considered synonymous with antisocial personality disorder. This is what the 5th edition of the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders tells us. Literally, psychopathy means mind suffering, but it cannot be viewed from traditional views of mental disorders. Psychopaths are not disoriented, lack a sense of reality, or suffer from delusions, hallucinations, or marked distress. Unlike psychotic personalities, psychopaths think rationally, and in many situations even more rationally than normal people. They are clearly aware of what they do and why they do it. Their actions are the result of meaningful choices. The confusion with the meaning is intensified by the fact that in the media, and in general among ordinary people, it is often used as a synonym for the words mentally ill and insane. However, if a person with schizophrenia breaks the law, say, commits murder on the orders of aliens from another galaxy, we may consider him not guilty by reason of insanity. If a psychopath commits the same act, he is recognized as sane and jailed. Many murderers such as Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and others have been found to be psychopaths, that is, by modern legal and psychiatric standards, mentally responsible people. Their actions were not based on mental illness, but on cold and calculating reasoning. What image does the word psychopath conjure up in your mind? How do you envision them? Maybe it's an individual with a tough-looking face, who you want to stay away from the first time you see them. People often think of a psychopath in this way. They think that the appearance of a psychopath is as unpleasant as their essence. But more often than not, this is completely untrue. In fact, these monsters usually look and act even more normal than their typical brothers and sisters. They create a more convincing picture of virtue than perhaps virtue itself. Just as a wax rosebud or a plastic peach seems more appealing to us, more consistent with our ideas about roses or peaches, than their imperfect originals. Little further on you will see what is meant. Robert Hare, a Canadian professor of psychology, has spent much of his academic career researching the phenomenon of psychopathy. Together with his colleagues, he has developed a checklist of questions for assessing psychopathy that allow you to more or less accurately determine the degree of a person's psychopathy. This list is respected worldwide, and many psychiatrists use it to assess and identify psychopathic traits. The maximum number of points that can be scored on this test is 40. 40 is the extreme version of a psychopath, the quintessence of the traits of the syndrome. The borderline between normality and pathology is considered to be 28 points. Anyone who scores less than 28 cannot be considered a clinical psychopath. But more to the point, the psychopath is extremely narcissistic, arrogant, strikingly self-centered, and pretentious. They consider themselves the center of the universe, superior creatures who are allowed to live by their own rules. Their hallmark is absolute self-confidence, and this is not some kind of contrived confidence, which is the reverse of an inferiority complex. When you are trying to please someone or give a presentation in front of a crowd, you are constantly worried about how you look, how you behave. You are afraid of appearing funny, stupid, or unattractive. Because of this constant fear, your mind is distracted by all these reflections, your thoughts get confused, and your movements look awkward. A psychopath, on the other hand, is believed to have differences in the amygdala compared to the average person. As a consequence, the psychopath may not experience fear in the same way, and therefore does not react with anxiety. Their manners and gestures are filled with firmness and unwavering determination. To others, they appear as personalities with intense charisma. Because of their reduced fear response, they don't really care what people think. Hence, their behavior seems so natural, and their charm knows no bounds. I will say more. Such notions as self-confident or, on the contrary, insecure for a psychopath are kind of artificial. In a world populated only by psychopaths, such word combinations would not even arise. Georgetown University researcher Abigail Marsh tested the response to facial expressions in 36 children between the ages of 7 and 10. Abigail showed them images of people with different emotions while brain activity was recorded using magnetic resonance imaging. Most had no difficulty naming each emotion depicted on the face. However, those children who scored high on the psychopathic tendency rating, while naming all the emotions accurately, had no idea which emotion was depicted here. Yes, fear is unknown to them in almost every sense. This is what one psychopath stated. I don't quite understand what the others mean by the word fear. When I robbed banks, I noticed that the tellers would start shaking or become speechless. One of them threw up on the money. She must have felt very bad, but I don't understand why. If someone pointed a gun at me, I'd probably be scared too, but I certainly wouldn't have thrown up. When asked what he might experience in such a situation, he gave answers that had nothing to do with bodily sensations. He said something like, I would have given you the money. I would have thought of some way to trick you. But when asked what he might still be feeling rather than thinking or doing, the psychopath was unable to give an intelligible answer. For most of us, fear and apprehension are associated with various unpleasant physical sensations: sweaty palms, increased heart rate, dry mouth, muscle tension or weakness in the body, trembling, and stomach cramps. We often mention these when we describe an experience of fear. I was so scared that my heart went straight to my heels. Or I couldn't say anything because my throat was dry. Psychopaths, on the other hand, experience fear superficially, at the level of consciousness and without the physiological coloring that most of us find unpleasant and from which we would like to protect ourselves. Laboratory studies using physiological measurements have shown that psychopaths do not exhibit the physiological changes that normally accompany feelings of fear. The significance of this finding is that for most of us, fear caused by the threat of possible pain or punishment is an unpleasant feeling and a powerful factor in motivating behavior. Fear causes us to do something or not to do something. Either way, it is the emotional realization of the consequences that drives us to act in one way or another. But it's different with psychopaths. They are happy to take up the cause, even though they know how it may turn out for them. However, the reason for this lies in something else. A psychopath is absolutely results-oriented. We have a so-called pleasure center in our brains that's activated by the sensation of reward. So, according to scientist Joshua Buchholz from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, the brains of psychopaths not only have heightened dopamine responses compared to those of normal people, but they also overvalue its importance. As a consequence of this exaggerated dopamine response, once the psychopath is focused on getting the reward, he is no longer able to change the focus of his attention until he gets what he seeks. This is why psychopaths are so susceptible to boredom. They cannot sit still. They need constant stimulation and forward motion. Hence the unquenchable thirst for success, money, and power, and also a fierce motivation to reach their goals by any means possible. Even for the sake of short-term pleasure, they are willing to exceed the speed limit, lose money in casinos, and seek partners for one night. Not surprisingly, psychopaths are often addicts not only in the figurative sense. Alcohol, cigarettes, and other slightly less legal drugs cause them much more euphoria, which leads to much more stable addiction. For the same reason, psychopaths are pathological liars. They lie not only to achieve their self-serving goals, but also because it gives them pleasure. The motivation for many of their false statements is what psychologist Paul Ekman called duping delight. Ordinary people also experience this from successful deception, but the pleasure is most often sharply dulled by the fear of exposure. Psychopaths, on the other hand, get a dose of pure euphoria. In addition, psychopaths usually have a very glib tongue. They can tell incredible stories about themselves around the clock. Most often they try to show their competence in sociology, psychiatry, medicine, psychology, philosophy, poetry, literature, art, or law. The authoritativeness with which the psychopath speaks makes those around them sincerely believe their words, and it is very hard to blame them for this. All this is complemented by an absolute lack of empathy. Psychopaths don't care about other people's feelings. To some extent, they resemble individuals who cannot experience what others feel. One offender who scored high on a checklist of psychopathy traits remarked that he found it difficult to sympathize with his victims. They're scared. Then, I don't understand them. I've been scared too, but it wasn't something unpleasant for me. Psychopaths treat those around them as means of satisfying their wants and needs. The weak and vulnerable, who are more likely to be exploited by psychopaths, are their favorite victims. In the universe of psychopaths, there is no such thing as simply weak, writes psychologist Paul Babiak. In their view, whoever is weak is stupid. That is, he himself is asking to be used. To survive, both physically and mentally, some individuals have to develop a certain insensitivity to certain categories of people. So, for example, if a doctor is too empathetic towards his patients, he will soon become overwhelmed with emotion and his effectiveness will decrease. By the same token, soldiers, mobsters, and terrorists are trained to think of the enemy as a soulless object rather than a living person. Psychopaths demonstrate precisely the general lack of empathy. They are indifferent to the rights and suffering of outsiders, as well as those close to them. If they maintain a relationship with their spouse or children, it is only because they consider them their property, like a tape recorder or a car. Because of their inability to empathize, some psychopaths commit acts that seem incomprehensible to normal people. They may, for example, torture or mutilate a victim with the same emotion with which we butcher lamb for kebabs. Having done something horrible, psychopaths feel no guilt or remorse afterward. They never regret anything. One psychopath sentenced to 6 years for murder described his crime this way. My friend's 1-year-old daughter had been crying for a long time, so I reluctantly decided to change her diaper so I wouldn't, smell it. She crapped on my hands and I lost my temper. I picked her up by her leg and slammed her against the wall. He said the last words with a smile on his face. Another psychopath, when asked if he regretted stabbing a robbery victim who had to spend 3 months in the hospital because of his wounds, he said, "Look at things soberly. He spent months in hospital, and I'm rotting here. I only cut him up a little bit. If I wanted to kill him, I would have slit his throat. That's the kind of guy I am." I gave him a vacation. Before the death penalty, serial killer Ted Bundy, who, by the way, scored 39 out of 40 on a checklist of psychopathy traits, spoke directly about guilt. No matter what I've done in the past, all those experiences don't bother me. Try to touch the past. Try to change it. It's not real. It's just a dream. Bundy's dream cost the lives of hundreds of young women. He not only walked away from his past, but also redrew the future of each of his victims. Here's one of his prison statements. Guilt, we use it to keep people under control. It's an illusion. It's nothing but one of the levers to control society. This feeling is very dangerous. It does terrible things to our bodies. There are far more effective ways to control behavior than this rather unusual exploitation of guilt. The psychopath's lack of guilt and regret is complemented by their distinctive ability to find reasonable explanations for their behavior and to shift responsibility for their acts to circumstances, family, friends, associates, and others who play by the rules. A psychopath will always find excuses for their behavior or deny involvement entirely.
Building up of this destructive energy, another factor here that I haven't mentioned is the use of alcohol. But I think that what alcohol did, in conjunction with, let's say, my exposure to pornography, was alcohol reduced my inhibitions. At the same time, the fantasy life that was fueled by pornography eroded them further.
Obviously, a psychopath makes new acquaintances with ease and enters into numerous friendships and intimate relationships, but they have absolutely no need for heartfelt companionship. They do not know the feeling of deep affection or love. The psychopath sees the purpose of friendship or love only in mutual use, and therefore at any moment, for selfish motives, they may set up or betray others and be very proud of themselves. For a psychopath, any relationship is a kind of chess game in which they may sacrifice pawns to eventually put you in checkmate. Cunning and manipulation are their natural talents. Although cold and emotionless, psychopaths tend to show their emotions in dramatic, albeit short-lived, ways. Close observers get the impression that they are simply playing a role. Although psychopaths are quick to anger, they do not lose control of themselves. On the contrary, when they explode, their behavior resembles acting out a temper tantrum. They know exactly what they are doing. Their aggression is cold because they are unaware of the range of emotions that others experience when they get worked up. Psychopaths may claim to be overwhelmed by strong feelings, but they are unable to describe the subtleties of different emotional states. For example, they may equate sexual desire with love, frustration with sadness, and irritation with anger. Many medical professionals express the view that the emotions of psychopaths are so superficial that they resemble proto-emotions. In other words, the body's primitive response to immediate needs. Despite his social status, this is one of the most dangerous sociopaths I have ever seen. Those were the words of a Superior Court judge after sentencing 37-year-old San Jose attorney Norman Russell Seenberg. He embezzled his client's money and then brutally murdered her. Norman's third wife, Terry, who initially covered for him, later recounted that when she first saw him, she found him to be a pleasant, outgoing, and incredibly charming man. She recounted that from the beginning, Russell talked about an emotional vacuum, an inability to feel what others felt. He didn't know when to cry and when to laugh. Terry added that his emotional life was devoid of emotion and that he read psychology books to learn how to respond appropriately to everyday events. When their marriage began to disintegrate, Russell tried to convince his wife that she was delusional. At my psychologist appointments, I was always nervous, but Russell was calm, kind, and reasonable. He would usually turn to the doctor and say, "Look who I have to put up with." I couldn't take it anymore, and I'd yell, "It's not me, he's crazy." Guess which side the psychologist's sympathies were on. Later, Russell developed several scenarios for solving the problem with his wife and wrote them down on a piece of paper. Do nothing. File divorce papers. Take the girls without killing. Take the girls to kill. Kill the girls injusting. The horror that overwhelms us when we hear such inhuman and mesmerizing stories prevents us from noticing the main point. Psychopathy is often complemented by narcissism and Machiavellianism. These properties of the psyche make up the so-called dark triad, but the dark triad only sometimes, in rare cases, becomes a dark tetrad by adding sadism to itself. Most psychopaths make their way through life without killing. Most of them don't commit egregious crimes. By focusing too much attention on psychopaths who score extremely high on the checklist, we are missing something much more important. We are losing sight of psychopaths with high intelligence and lower scores on the Robert Hare questionnaire. Psychopaths who, masquerading as normal people and mimicking emotions, have adapted perfectly in modern society. They are difficult to study because they are not in prison. They do not give themselves away in almost any way, and even more than that, the so-called functional psychopaths have imperceptibly become our role models. Kevin Dutton, a British psychologist and writer specializing in the study of psychopathy, believes that psychopathic traits turned up to full power are poisonous and lead to a fall to the social bottom. By contrast, however, the same qualities in moderate doses promote unprecedented personal growth. Egocentricity gives inexhaustible faith in oneself. Fearlessness, lack of regrets, and focus on results give absolute stress resistance and the ability to take risks without stopping at anything. Lack of empathy, guilt, and compassion allow one to step on heads and not constantly turn around on the ethical side of this or that issue. A psychopath will never be without a romantic partner because both men and women easily fall in love with someone confident, insensitive to refusals, persistent, charming, and charismatic, and remembering their tendency toward pathological lying. A psychopath may be the very person you've been waiting for, the one who will give you a sea of diametrically opposite emotions that you will certainly get hooked on. They will probably emotionally drain you, destroy your self-esteem, and when they are sure that they have taken everything, they will leave, and you'll miss them and remember them, maybe even for the rest of your life. But if you reject them completely from the beginning, they will immediately switch to another person, thinking that there is something wrong with you. This all sounds like paranoia, but let's look at the statistics. If we take society as a whole, the number of psychopaths in it is on average equal to 1%. But here's what's interesting. Moving up the social pyramid, getting to some top managers and other cream of society, we find that the number of psychopaths increases to 4%. A study by Paul Babiak, a New York-based psychologist working in industrial and organizational psychology, tells us this. Functional psychopaths with high intelligence have taken the comfortable chairs of big executives, lawyers, business people, and financiers. Why is this so? Perhaps one answer is that capitalism inherently encourages many psychopathic traits, thereby cultivating a certain kind of person. In an interview for Discover magazine, Robert Hare himself argues that psychopathy is not merely a neurological disorder, but also the result of evolutionary adaptation. For most people, the pain of losing $10 is greater than the joy of winning the same $10. Studies have shown that in a coin flip game, the vast majority of people are only willing to bet their hard-earned $10 if the potential gain is at least $20. And real life, speaking in the most general sense, very rarely provides such a risk-to-reward ratio. That's why most people prefer never to take risks, because you can't lose without taking risks. But what they don't realize is that you can't win without taking risks. This is the reason why psychopaths, with their willingness to take risks, often make their way to the top. Where you see the risk of losing, they see the possibility of winning. If in 1 out of 100 attempts you succeed, and in the 99 remaining attempts you have a damaged ego or an empty wallet, after how many failed attempts will you break? A psychopath cannot break down by definition. Clive Boddy, a former professor at Nottingham Business School, stated in an issue of the Journal of Business Ethics that once in the boss's offices of major financial institutions, psychopaths build their careers through a combination of extroverted personal charisma and charm that make their behavior invisible, and worse, allow psychopaths to appear as normal and even perfect executives. It follows from Boddy's analysis that once in the coveted boss chair, they can influence the morale of the entire organization and enjoy great power. Boddy ends his article with a sharp indictment. He concludes that psychopaths are responsible for the global financial crisis because their unscrupulous pursuit of personal enrichment and exaltation, while ignoring all other considerations, has led to the abandonment of the old-fashioned concepts of noblesse oblige, equality, fairness, and any other real notion of corporate social responsibility. For obvious reasons, psychopaths are also attracted to professions such as police officer, journalist, surgeon, civil servant, sales manager, and clergyperson. Fearlessness, enterprise, and brilliant business acumen can make a psychopath a successful businessperson, drug lord, mobster, dictator, or president. And they'll be extremely good at what they do. However, as always, it's not that simple. Joseph Newman, professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, does not believe that psychopaths are incapable of feeling fear, that they are some kind of emotionless void, as they are traditionally portrayed. Newman believes that, in fact, psychopaths simply don't notice fear, just as an arachnophobe doesn't experience fear from a tarantula overhead until they see one. In one clever experiment, Newman demonstrated that this is exactly what can happen in psychopaths. They don't feel distress and don't notice this emotion in others because they are completely focused on a task that promises immediate reward. They simply discard everything that is not directly related to it. This is called emotional tunnel vision. Newman and coworkers offered a group of psychopaths and non-psychopaths a series of pictures with incorrect captions such as those shown in the figure. The task was simple enough: to name what was depicted in the picture, ignoring the incorrect inscription. The explicit instruction to name the image conflicts with the desire to read the words, and this leads to oscillation. This fluctuation has the name of Stroop interference and is a measure of attentional focus. The faster you perform this task, the narrower your focus of attention. The results of the study were extremely telling. Time and again, Newman found that non-psychopathic volunteers were confused by the mismatch between the pictures and their captions, and it took them a while to name all the pictures correctly. However, the trend changed dramatically in those volunteers who scored 28 or more on the psychopathy trait checklist. They completed the tasks with ease, clearly oblivious to the confounding inconsistencies. They just didn't seem to be processing the side vision cues that seemed obvious to everyone else. And it wasn't that they weren't perceiving them. Quite the opposite. In a separate experiment, Newman and colleagues offered psychopaths and non-psychopaths a series of letter sequences on a computer screen that randomly appeared either at the top or bottom of the screen. Some of the letters were red, others were green. Volunteers were told that they would be electrocuted occasionally when some of the red letters appeared, as might be expected, when volunteers were only asked to answer whether the letters appeared at the bottom or top of the screen. Psychopaths showed significantly lower levels of anxiety than non-psychopaths. But incredibly, when the task was switched and volunteers were asked to say exactly what color letters appeared on the screen, this trend, as predicted by Newman and colleagues, turned into the exact opposite. This time it was the psychopaths who showed more nervousness. Here's what Newman thinks. People think psychopaths are rude and devoid of fear. But it's not that simple. When psychopaths are emotionally focused, we see them exhibit normal emotional responses. But when they are focused on something else, they become completely insensitive to emotion. Kevin Dutton, in his book, The Wisdom of Psychopaths, tells about his friend Tom, who serves in the British Special Forces and participated in covert operations in the hottest, most remote and dangerous corners of our planet, stabbing with the Taliban in dark, deep underground caves in the mountains of northern Afghanistan can hardly be called every soldier's favorite thing to do. However, Tom has high scores on the Robert Hare questionnaire and simply loves his job. Tom wrote the following story. One evening, a few years ago, I was walking back to my apartment after seeing Saw in the movies. Suddenly, a guy with a knife jumped out towards me. My girlfriend freaked out and started breathing rapidly, but I calmly disarmed the guy and twisted him. And here's the funny thing. I really thought the movie was scary, but then, when I suddenly found myself in a real-life situation, I was, how shall I put it, I guess, turned on. Nothing happened. No worries, no drama, just nothing. The unprecedented ability of psychopaths to concentrate on the task at hand without being affected by fear and other feelings is an extremely useful trait that can make a person a great trader, pilot, poker player, con artist, race car driver, surgeon, or assassin, for that matter. The spheres of application of this skill are too numerous to presumptuously try to enumerate them, and the further we study these people, the more interesting it gets. Recent experiments show that psychopaths are, incredibly, able to turn empathy on arbitrarily. Researchers placed criminals with psychopathic tendencies in an MRI machine, showing them videos of one of the characters hurting another. As expected, the videos made no impression on the subjects, but things changed when the researcher asked the subjects to empathize with the person in pain. After the request, the area of the brain responsible for the sensation of pain in psychopaths activated. Based on the brain scanner readings, they actually felt someone else's pain. What's next? Are psychopaths altruistic? Very possibly. Mehmet Mahmood from Macquarie University in Sydney discovered something surprising. It turns out psychopaths can be even more altruistic than normal people under certain circumstances. The experiment consisted of 3 parts. Among the subjects were people with psychopathic tendencies and a control group of normal people. In the first part, Mahmoud's accomplices approached the subjects, pretending to be lost, and asked them to point the way. Psychopaths, as expected, offered their help less often than non-psychopaths. No surprises. In the second part, the request for help was not so explicit. An unfortunate woman was hastily trying to pick up a stack of papers that had fallen apart. Suddenly, the gap in altruism mysteriously disappeared. Both psychopaths and non-psychopaths offered their help the same number of times. In the third part of the experiment, the request became even less explicit. Female lab worker, who supposedly had broken her arm, was pretending to have difficulty opening a water bottle and entering the experiment participant's name on a fake form. But she bravely tried to overcome the effects of her injury. And then something happened that is completely out of character with psychopaths. In fact, they showed a greater willingness to open the bottle and put their name on the form than non-psychopaths. When a person was in a truly difficult situation and yet did not actively try to get help from others, psychopaths were willing to do good. When serious things are involved, they are much more willing to come to the rescue than their at least perceived to be kinder, heartier, and more sympathetic fellow citizens. It is only natural that the results of Mahmoud's experiments will cause many to raise their eyebrows in bewilderment. One explanation for these results may be that there is no such thing as a truly altruistic act. It always disguises well an ulterior selfish, much more disreputable motive, and the psychopaths in Mahmoud's experiments, with their subtle and highly sensitive tuning to detect vulnerability, simply smelled blood. The novelist Somerset Maugham wrote in his work, Of Human Bondage, there is always a note of pleasure in active acts. A man does things because they are good for him, and if they turn out to be good for other people, he is considered virtuous. You give 2 pence to a beggar for your own pleasure, just as I drink a glass of whiskey and soda for mine. And since I am less prone to self-deception than you are, I do not applaud myself for my pleasure, nor do I demand your admiration. We admire those who selflessly help people, regardless of the selfless person's true motives. We admire people who are capable of taking risks to achieve goals, people that always live outside of some comfort zone, those whose lives at every moment are mottled with all colors and shades. We, mired in the humdrum of our monotonous existence, are drawn to such people and look up to them as much as we can. I've already mentioned in passing the psychopathic guy in the British Special Forces. The thing is, he's not the only one out there. One of the first things you encounter in camp is teasing. It happens all the time. Everybody insults and makes fun of each other, and there's a reason for that, as there is for most things in the regiment. You learn to be a gray mouse in case you get captured, to act inconspicuous to impress upon those who will interrogate you that you don't know anything, that you're of no use to them. If those who took you prisoner know anything at all, they start looking for your weaknesses, tracing your smallest reactions, the fleeting facial expressions, the tiniest eye movements that might give away your real psychological state. If they find anything, they'll get it out of you. It can't be helped, buddy. Game over. Bullying is purely functional in nature. It's an effective way of developing psychological immunity, an inoculation against the hardships that can come at you if you get captured. It's the right kind of wrong, if you know what I'm talking about. And then, there's nothing like nervous excitement, is there? The fact that Special Forces fighters are both fearless and psychologically stable, as well as possessing signs of psychopathy, is not debatable. In fact, SAS instructors specifically look for these qualities in candidates during the brutal 9-month selection process that only a handful of volunteers undergo. Some have nightmares about how the selection trials go on. One example given by a guy who rose to the top gives a pretty good idea of the kind of psychological resilience that separates the men from the boys. This example describes the mindset and elite psychological character of those who ultimately emerge victorious. It's not the brutality that breaks you down, it's the threat of brutality. These corrosive thoughts that something terrible is about to happen, and that it's already near. He detailed one particular example that will forever turn some away from fixing their car's exhaust system themselves. Usually at this stage, the candidate is completely exhausted. The last thing he sees before we put the hood over his head is a multi-ton truck. We place the candidate on the ground, and as he lies there, he hears the sound of the truck approaching. After about 30 seconds, the truck looms over him. The engine is only a few centimeters from his ear. The engine roars, and then the driver jumps out of the cab, slams the door, and walks away. The truck's engine continues to run. A little while later, someone from afar asks if there is a handbrake. At this point, one of our team members makes the truck's engine roar in order to give the impression that it is approaching. At this time, another team member begins to gently press the spare tire against the temple of the lying candidate. You understand, manually. Gradually, he increases the pressure. After a few seconds, we remove the spare tire, tear off the hood, and pounce on him. People very often give up after such a test. Or here's another screening test. Chained to the floor in a cold, dimly lit warehouse, you watch crushed with terror as a hoist holds a concrete slab a few feet above your head, then begins to slowly lower it. You feel the sharp, rough base of the slab begin to press lightly against your chest. The slab weighs in this position for 10 to 15 seconds before the operator yells something about the ominous hydraulics. something about the mechanism being jammed, and he can't move it. Waves of terror come over you one after another, but only then, far away from that stark, dark warehouse, do you realize you were as safe as you were at home. The concrete slab had nothing to do with concrete. It was painted styrofoam, and the forklift mechanism was perfectly fine. But in that moment, you don't know all of that. In that moment, it's all terrifyingly real. Guy named Jamie, who passed all the qualifying tests without much difficulty, spoke of the ordeal this way. Even if the mechanism jammed, that doesn't mean the slab would collapse on you, right? It would only mean that you'd be stuck for a while. So what of it? They say courage is a good quality. But what if courage isn't required at all? What then? What if you have no fear to begin with? If you don't have fear to begin with, you don't need courage to overcome it, right? The whole concrete slab and spare tire thing didn't bother me. But that doesn't make me brave. There's this thing about fear, or in what I understand fear to be, because honestly, I don't think I've ever experienced it. For the most part, it's never validated. Which is what they say, 99% of the things people worry about never happen. So what is the point of fear? I think the problem is that people spend so much time worrying about what might happen, what might go wrong, because they have completely lost touch with the present. They completely lose sight of the fact that everything is actually fine right now. Yes, it's not the violence that breaks you, it's the threat of it. So why not stay in the present moment? Be in the here and now. While you're lying under what you mistake for concrete, nothing bad is actually happening to you. And if you fell asleep there in the warehouse, that would be your wisest act. Instead, people give themselves over to their imagination. Their brains run in fast-forward mode, whizzing and grinding through every conceivable and unthinkable misfortune that could happen to them. So at every opportunity, don't let your brain run ahead of you. Do this constantly, and sooner or later you will give up the habit of courage. Carpe diem, limiting thoughts to the present moment, focusing solely on the here and now, is the cognitive discipline that links psychopathy and spiritual enlightenment. Research on cognitive and emotional focus in the context of dysfunctional decision-making has shown, when we evaluate ordinary everyday behavior, things like meeting an important client or calling on the phone to deliver bad news, the imagined potential reality is far more discomforting than the actual reality. Our lives are filled with terrible suffering, most of which never happened. This explains the unquenchable thirst to put things off. But psychopaths don't put anything off. That's one of the reasons they tend to excel in any field of endeavor. They have to do something. Doing nothing is not their choice. So maybe you're a psychopath. Maybe your acquaintance, friend, relative, boyfriend, or girlfriend is a psychopath. How do you even realize you're dealing with a psychopath? You see, psychopathic traits are inherent in many people, but that doesn't make them psychopaths. Even many hardened criminals are capable of genuine love, empathy, remorse, and guilt. So it's not easy for the average person to identify a clinical psychopath. Unless you're a psychopath yourself, they are just as easy to recognize their own as people with schizophrenia. But what are ordinary people to do? There are a couple of things, besides the obvious ones, that will help verify a social predator or make an assumption with a certain degree of probability. Look into the eyes of a stranger on the street without looking away for 6 seconds. It's not easy, is it? Strangers are uncomfortable making eye contact. They look away all the time. I think you can guess why. Fear. If we didn't have fear, we'd look at people the way we look at paintings. And psychopaths rarely look away to look normal, but they usually don't bother to do it much. Hence their success in social dominance and attracting attention. A direct gaze is an act of aggression on the one hand, and a way to arouse interest on the other. An unnaturally long stare is the first thing that will help you when checking out. However, familiar people can look into each other's eyes for long periods of time, and there is nothing wrong with that. In this case, the long eye contact is a consequence of interest and a demonstration that we are comfortable with each other. Hence method number 2, trust your instincts. When alone with a psychopath, the average person may become instinctively fearful, feeling some kind of elusive threat. You sense that there's something wrong with them, A psychopath doesn't understand emotions well, and therefore their facial expressions don't always look natural.
You are guilty of killing many women and girls. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes, that's true.
Ted, how did it happen? Take me back. What are the antecedents of the behavior that we've seen? So much grief, so much sorrow, so much pain for so many people. Where did it start? How did this moment come about?
Consciously, you hardly notice it, but your brain enters a state of cognitive dissonance every time the emotional words of the interlocutor do not correspond to the micro-expressions on their face. A psychopath appears as an unpredictable entity to the average person's brain, and therefore causes a subconscious fear of the unknown. This is called the unconscious fear of the uncanny valley effect. The uncanny valley effect is the hypothesis that an object that looks or acts like a person, having minor inconsistencies with a real person, causes fear in the observer. And that's not all. We ordinary people learn to artificially hide some of our emotions, while they learn to artificially display them. For them, emotions are like a second language. Remember, when you try to explain yourself in a foreign language, you start waving your hands more actively. The same thing happens with the gesticulation of a psychopath when they have to talk about things related to feelings. The most radical way is to scare them. If the attempt was truly worthy, but they were not afraid, then there is a high probability that in front of you is the same social predator. In any case, only a qualified specialist can accurately say whether a person is a psychopath or not, based on psychological assessments and diagnostic tools. One should never label anyone as a psychopath. Nietzsche writes that the nature of morality is to teach us to hate too much freedom and to instill in us the need for limited horizons. Morality teaches a narrowing of perspective, and therefore stupidity, as a condition of life and growth. The need to obey is in the blood of modern humans, since at all times there have been human herds, such as clans, communities, tribes, nations, churches, and states, and there have always been too many who obey in relation to a small number who command. The voice in our heads that commands, "You must do this and that, unconditionally, and you must certainly not do that. In short, you must." The need to obey is so great that we obey everything and everyone. Parents, teachers, laws, prejudices, public opinion. The extraordinary limitation of human development. Its slowness, its languor, its frequent reversion and stagnation. All this is due to the fact that the herd instinct of obedience is inherited very successfully and to the detriment of the art of commanding. A significant example of this is Milgram's experiment, in which 89% of the subjects, ordinary people obeying authority, continued to administer electric shocks to a person even after he began to protest and asked to stop, and 65% brought the voltage to the maximum level, which was labeled as dangerous. And these were well-meaning people. Some of them cried, begging the man in the lab coat to stop the experiment. But when the experimenter said, "Please continue," these people pressed the button again and again. A perfect illustration, for example, of how the same society that produced Beethoven, Kepler, and Goethe could suddenly start methodically exterminating people who didn't meet certain external criteria. Let's think hard about the following thought. All human morality, says Nietzsche, is fueled by fear, and if it were possible to completely destroy all imaginary and real dangers, then at the same time morality itself would be completely destroyed. Man does not become what he should be because he is afraid. All his life he is afraid. Man lives his whole life surrounded by paralyzing fear that cuts off everything he can achieve, everything he can become. Fear of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, fear of losing his possessions, fear of death, and most of all fear of what people will think.
Why don't people trust their instincts? They sense something is wrong, someone is walking too close behind them. You knew something was wrong, but you came back into the house. Did I force you? Did I drag you in? No. All I had to do was offer you a drink. It's hard to believe that fear of offending him is stronger than the fear of pain, but you know what? It is.
So, how's your morality? Most likely, you adhere to the principle of don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself. But it's much easier for a psychopath to judge themselves and others by the unchanging evolutionary standard of survival of the fittest. A psychopath will not say that the ability to experience love, guilt, fear, or compassion is an essential mark of a good person. The psychopath is born free of emotional shackles, free of all things human. He is not subject to authority because he is his own authority. Reason prevails over feelings, so he is more likely to think that there is no universal, much less objective, morality in the world. A psychopath is not afraid to get his hands dirty and do what others lack the courage to do. That is why there are so many psychopathic personalities among the leaders in different spheres. Friedrich Nietzsche became a prophet of a number of horrifyingly disastrous catastrophes of the 20th century. He predicted the collapse of European spirituality, the devaluation of its values, the revolt of the masses with the subsequent reign of the coming nihilism, the leveling of man under the banner of universal equality of people, the struggle for dominance over the world, and totalitarianism as a consequence of the democratization of Europe. But in addition, Nietzsche predicted that the current weak and despicable human being would be replaced by someone more perfect. According to Nietzsche, it will be radical egocentrics who know no fear, pity, or regret, who bless life in its most extreme manifestations, people who no longer belong to the species Homo sapiens, but who will form a new, powerful biological species, Homo super sapiens. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us move forward.